Hello, welcome to the next episode of the Pawn Endgames. This time we'll be talking about so-called moving square. And now why it is important you will see in a second, and now let's get into it. What we are going to learn this time. What is the moving square and why it is important to know about it? What is the difference between a floating square and the moving square? How to figure out and draw the moving square? How many moving squares are there? What are the benefits of reaching any of the moving square types? Is there any types of moving square once you reach it you do not need to make any calculations? What is the common box and how it is connected to touching the last rank by moving square? Why the moving square that goes beyond the last rank reminds of the rectangle instead of a square? What happens when the opponent's king stands between the separated pawns on the starting position? What is the rule one must know about moving square that touches the last rank? What is the rule one must know about the moving square that doesn't touch the last rank? Why two pawns on the same rank on the adjacent files are the strongest formation? What are the simple plans to win having two pawns advantage with the pawns on the same rank or connected ones? What are the rules to know about the pawns on the same rank separated by one file? When more calculation is needed to figure out if one of the pawns can promote without the king's support. And now let's have a look why these moving squares or the floating squares are that much important to recognize and understand. First, we can see the square that is not touching the last rank on the left side, and we can see that the top side of the square doesn't touch the last rank, and therefore we'll be calling this one far to box. How to remember this? It is something like the wordplay of too far box, the box that is too far away from the last rank, therefore the wordplay far to box. The second case is whenever we are having the box that is touching the last rank, and then it is something like a common box. Why? Because it is the same square of the passed pawn for the pawn on the left side like on the right side. Therefore, it's so-called common box whenever the square touches the last rank. And the third example, the third type, as we can see, this is something like a cutoff box. Why? Because if the pawns are separated by some of the files, and then if you are drawing the square to the last rank, it goes beyond the last rank. And it looks like a cutoff box, therefore the name cutoff box. A little bit easier to understand. Therefore, to summarize, if the square doesn't touch the last rank, it is called far to box. If it touches the last rank, it's a common box. And if it goes beyond the last rank, it is cutoff box. And now, what is going on about the evaluation, you may ask? With the far to box, we have the following situation. White wins only when they transpose into common box. Therefore, at this moment, we need to figure out where are the kings, especially where is the black king, and if the black king can capture one of the pawns. And on the middle of the picture, we can see the common box. With common box, the task is way easier. Why? Because white loses only when king can capture any pawns. What does it mean? In practice, black king needs to be in one of the squares with the contact of the pawns, and whenever black king captures one of the pawn, it can capture the other if the white king doesn't support the pawns. And the right side, it is the idea if there is the cutoff box, white always wins. Why? Because no matter where is the black king, if one pawn is captured, the other advances. Therefore, we are just trying to reach every time the cutoff box. If it is not possible, try to get the common box. And if the king cannot capture immediately one of the pawn, it's win as well. And if we're having the far to box, then we need to have some kind of analysis. Analysis, recognition, and visualization, you may ask. At the cutoff box is pretty simple because there is no calculation needed. We only need to recognize if we are just having cutoff box position. If we just reach that, it's the win regardless who is on the move. On the second position with the common box, we are just having so-called micro calculation. It is something like just recognition if the pawn, one of the pawns can be captured immediately. If not, it's the winning position. If it is captured, the other pawn is going to be captured as well, as long as the white king doesn't support it. And the last one, at this moment, as I just mentioned, this is the most demanding one, so-called normal calculation is needed. We need to make some kind of visualization and calculation. Therefore, if we can try to reach cutoff box, it is the automatic win. If you are getting the common box, it's win if the one pawn is not immediately captured, and if we are having far to box, if the box doesn't touch the last rank, then we need to make some kind of calculation, some kind of visualization. If we can reach the common box, when the king cannot capture the pawn immediately, we are just having pretty easy position, and if we reach the cutoff box, we do not calculate anything, it is just win regardless who is on the move. And let's have a look what happens when we have two pawns next to the other. And now, as we can see, two pawns next to each other are so powerful that they cannot allow the king to get closer to the pawns due to the squares that are protected by the pawns. Therefore, at this moment, the king cannot make the frontal attack because the pawns cannot allow for that. And now, what would be the plan? First of all, we can try to think how to reach one of these squares. If white king is able to reach one of these squares highlighted red, then we can have so-called stairway to heaven. After pushing the pawn will be able to get into the promotion square the same way as the other pawn if the king stands in one of these squares. Therefore, the plans are pretty simple, and in a moment we'll see how we can make them. Now, if the king is attacking the pawns from the side, it's a little bit different story. But due to the pawns that can get into the contact very quickly, one of the pawns can protect the other, or the king cannot capture the backward pawn because the more advanced can run into the promotion. And now let's have a look what could happen at this situation. The king is attacking the pawn. And now, either of the pawn can move forward, both moves are okay. The simplest way is to push the pawn that is being attacked into the pawn that is being protected. And therefore, after pushing the pawn forward, the king tries to get from the other side, tries to get into the squares that will be going back and forth. And at this moment, we are just getting closer and closer with our king and supporting the pawn. And now, important moment. As I just mentioned, the king cannot capture the backward pawn because the other pawn that is more advanced runs to the promotion. And therefore, we are going closer and closer. After reaching this type of position, the king cannot get to the less advanced pawns any longer. And now, after that, the simplest way is to have the same idea as previously, setting up the barrier on the 7th rank. And again, if the king wants to get into the pawns, he needs to get into the other side and capture the pawns because it cannot do it from the frontal attack. And now at this moment we are just making the king from the other side of the board. And if the king reaches this square, as we just mentioned, we are having stairway to heaven idea. And now if the king blocks that, we are going it anyway, because take notice that the king cannot get any closer, and at the same time the king is forced to get into one of the squares. And now at this moment we are having stairway to heaven, and we are just simply sacrificing one pawn, promoting the queen, winning easily. And now one more important moment. At this moment, if the king gets not on the square f8, but in the other direction, this is what happens. We can get the king from the other side, and after we get the king into the g7, we are having the stairway to heaven for the pawn f6. And now if the king objects, we are just going a little bit further, and in a moment the king is forced to run away, and now we are having stairway to heaven as we just mentioned previously, and winning easily. And now, as we can see, we can even sacrifice one of the pawn because we do not need to have that many. And now, what happens if the king is attacking the pawns not from the left side but from the right side? Does it make any difference? Technically no, because we are having the same idea and we are making the simplest idea possible, just protecting the pawn that is attacked. That's it. After the king gets the way that it wants the other position, we are just having this position. The king will be trying to go back and forth, but in a moment we are not allowing the king to do so because we are just having this square covered, and after the king gets to the last rank, we are making the same idea as previously. We are having impregnable wall on the 7th rank, and we can get one of the direction to get the pawn rolling. And now, what happens? We are just having the pawns that are protecting each other. At the previous examples, we were talking about the pawns that were standing next to each other. If the pawns are standing next to each other, one of the pawns is attacked. And now at this moment, the backward pawn is attacked, but the king cannot capture the backward pawn because more advanced pawns get to their promotion. And what do? We simply advance with the king. And now after that, we reach the same position as we discussed before, and then we are just making the wall that king cannot penetrate on the 7th rank, and the game is over. And now if the pawns are from the other color of squares, technically there is some difference, but conceptually there is no difference. We are going closer and closer. After we get closer, not allowing the king to go back and forth over these squares, the king is forced to get onto the last rank. And again, we are just making the squares covered on the 7th rank. The king cannot make the frontal attack, and we can get with the king one of the sides and getting the same idea. If we have the pawns that are separated by one file and they are standing on the same rank, we have the specific position. And the easiest way to explain it is if one of the pawns gets attacked, the other pawn advances. And now at this moment, if white gets closer to the pawns, it is going to be pretty easy win because one of the pawns can promote, and therefore if white is getting to the square b2, the king attacks one of the pawn. And as I just mentioned, if one of the pawn on the same rank, if they are pawns separated by one file, is getting attacked, the other pawn must advance. And now the king cannot capture the pawn that is less advanced, the backward pawn, because the other pawn gets to the promotion. And now at the same time, we can see the squares highlighted red that the king cannot approach because they are attacked by both of the pawns. Therefore, if the king wants to attack the other pawn, it needs to get the other way, something like that. And now let's see what happens. The king gets to the square d7, and now after the king gets closer and the opponent's king gets behind the pawns on the separated file, we need to make the pawns straight. We need to make the pawns on the same rank, otherwise we are going to lose one of the pawns. Just remember about it. And that's why the king gets between the pawns, we are pushing both pawns on the same rank, and now if the king gets from the right side attacking the pawn, we are getting the other pawn that is not being attacked. And as we can see, both of the squares highlighted blue are just covered by the pawns, and therefore the next move is the pawn promoting and white is winning. If the king gets the other way onto the square d7, we are just making the same situation. The pawn moves forward and the king cannot capture the pawn backwards because the other gets to the promotion, and the pawn f7 is unstoppable. Therefore, if we just see this type of position, we are having the pawns separated by one file. The simplest way is to remember, if one pawn gets attacked, the other moves forward, and independent which pawn is attacked, we are just going the other one. And now, what happens if the pawns are the less advanced? Does it make any difference? Technically, nope. Why? Because again, if one of the pawn is being attacked, the other advance, and as we can see, the king cannot capture the pawn that is backward because the pawn that is more advanced gets to the promotion. And that's why if the king tries to get into the pawns from the other side, take notice that these squares are covered by the pawns, then we are going closer. And very important, if the king stays between the pawns on the separated file, we need to make the pawns on the same rank. At this moment, the pawns must be on the 5th rank. That's why we are playing d5. And again, if the king gets for the one pawn, the other pawn gets forward. And if the king gets back, we are going closer. And if the king gets between the pawns on the separated file, we are just moving the pawns onto the same rank, and the process repeats. And again, if the king attacks the pawn, the other moves forward. If the king attacks the other pawn, the pawn from the f file moves forward. And in a moment, the pawn from f7, more advanced, is going to the promotion. Now the situation when the king is not attacking the pawn that is closer to our king, but the pawn that is way more advanced. Does it make any difference? Technically, nope. Why? Because both pawns are separated by one file, and the idea is the following. If one pawn is being attacked, the other moves forward. And again, the king cannot capture the backward pawn because the other gets to the promotion, and after the king gets between the pawns, we need to make the pawns on the same rank. And if the king attacks one of the pawn, we move the other. And again, if the king tries to get from the other side, we need to think. And remember, if the king gets into the line that is between the pawns, the separated one, we need to make the pawns on the same rank. And after that, the pawn gets to the promotion because the king cannot get into the square e8 or e7, and the pawns from the d file advance. And now let's see what happens when the pawns are separated by 2 files. And now, as we can see, the pawns are standing on the same rank, separated by 2 files. And now what needs to be done? First of all, we need to see how to draw the square. We are just drawing the square the following way. Between the pawns, there are 2 empty files, therefore the side of the square is 4 squares, and we are just drawing the square towards the line of the promotion. Therefore, at this moment, what is important? The square neither touches the last rank nor getting outside the last rank. Therefore, it doesn't touch the last rank. And now, if the pawns are higher on the 4th rank, at this moment, the square is the same, but the square is closer to the promoting line. And now, what is the most important? The most important is the pawns are not making the square that is touches the last rank. And now, after the pawns are on the 5th rank, as we can see, the square finally touches the last rank. Why it is important? It's going to be very soon explained. And now, if the pawns are on the 3rd rank, as we can see, again, the square is a little bit bigger because there are more files between the pawns that are not occupied, and therefore at this moment the square is 5 by 5. And again, the square doesn't touch the last rank. This is the most important to distinguish. After that, as we can see, the pawns are on the 4th rank. This time, the top side of the square touches the last rank. And now, if the pawns are on the 3rd rank, and at this moment we have the 6 by 6 square, top side of the square touches the last rank. And now, as we can see, at this moment, we are not having the square. It looks like a rectangle. Why is that? Because at this moment, the length of the side of the square is 7. One on the b3, the second one c3, third one d3, fourth one e3, fifth f3, sixth g3, and 7 h3. And if we just go forward, it is the h3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. What does it mean? The 7th would get outside the last rank. And therefore, if we like to draw the square would go beyond the last rank. And therefore, it looks like a cutoff square. And now, at this moment, we see the same idea. The pawns are separated by 6th rank. Therefore, the side of the square is 8. And now, the side of the square looks like a rectangle because the square cannot be drawn due to the lack of 2 ranks, the 9th and the 10th. But the most important is to recognize if the side of the square is getting to the last rank or it doesn't touch it or going beyond that. This is the most important. And another fragment, as we can see at this moment, the pawns are separated by 2 files, but take note that the pawns are on the 2nd rank. What does it mean? They are on the starting position. Therefore, if the king gets into one of the 2 squares between the pawns, the position is lost regardless who is on the move. And now if you are having a bigger square, it doesn't matter. If the king gets between the pawns on the 2nd rank, the position is lost. The same if the pawns are separated by more files, and more files. It doesn't matter. If the king is getting into one of the squares between the pawns on the 2nd rank, the position is totally lost, regardless who is on the move. What happens when we reach the cutoff box? What is the cutoff box? Just to remind. The cutoff box is whenever the pawns create the square that goes beyond the last rank. Why is that? Because the side of the square is the 5 squares, and we can see it cannot get into the last rank because the board is limited. Therefore, at this moment, we have the cutoff box. And now, why is that important? Because at this moment, whenever we reach the cutoff box, we are into the winning position because the king cannot capture both pawns. And now, let's check it out. Why is that? Square of the pawn is the following, and the king cannot get outside the square, capturing the pawn on the right side. Why? because if it captures the pawn, it gets outside the pawn box and the pawn reaches the promotion. And if the king is attacking the pawn that is close to the king, we are getting the other pawn as quickly as possible. After pushing the pawn forward, as we can see, the square makes a little bit smaller, and the king must reach the square in order to reach the pawn. After the king gets into the square, the other pawn advances. And again, we have the cutoff box. This time, it's a little bit closer to the promotion, therefore a way better. And if the king gets closer to the pawn, we reach the other pawn. And then after the capture, we are just promoting. Of course, if the king gets the other side, then we are getting the other pawn and the same. The king captures the pawn and the pawn promotes. And now if the king is attacking the pawn on the left side, we have the same type of position. If the pawn is attacked by the king, the other pawn that is more advanced is getting closer and closer. If white is to move, white gets with the king not touching the pawns, and after the king gets between the pawns, take notice that the square is going beyond the last rank, therefore so-called cutoff box, we are getting with the pawn. And now at this moment the king needs to stay into this square, otherwise the pawn promotes, and if the king gets closer, the other pawn moves forward, and the other pawn box is this following, and therefore if the king captures, the pawn gets to the promotion next two moves, and therefore it is going to win. And of course, if this would be the white to move, white can win this way as well. After f6, the square is like the following. If the king gets closer, after the pawn moves forward, the king attacks the pawn, the more advanced pawn, the pawn that is far away from the king, advances and then promotes. Therefore, the conclusion is the following. Whenever we reach the cutoff box, regardless who is on the move, we are having the winning position. And now what happens if the pawns are separated more than 1, 2, 3 files? At this moment separated by 4 files. As we can see, the pawns are creating so-called cutoff box. Why? Because the box is getting beyond the last rank. And now again, we are moving the pawn that is way more farther from the king, and after that the other pawn advances. Of course, if we just move the pawn immediately, it would be the same. If the king gets there, take notice that king cannot reach the pawn square, therefore it's pretty much lost. And now if the king is attacking the pawn on the right side, we are getting the pawn on the left side. As simple as that, and then the pawn promotes. And therefore, another conclusion, if the pawns are very much separated as far as possible, then the winning is even easier. And let's check out what happens if we have the common box. With the common box, the pawns are creating the square that touches the last rank, and therefore it is the common box. Why? Because it's common for both pawns. If we just draw the pawn box from the left pawn, it would be this way, and if they draw the pawn box from the right side, it would be this way. Therefore, if we just make this way, it's going to be the common pawn box. Therefore, common box is the simplest way to understand this concept. And now, what about that? At this moment, if the king cannot capture the pawn immediately, then if white is on the move, they get into the winning position. After the pawn moves forward, as we can see, the pawn box is the following. And the king must get into this square, because it cannot get into the e6 square due to the pawn attacking the square, otherwise the pawn reaches the promotion. After the king gets to the pawn, the other pawn that is not attacked moves forward. And then if the king gets for the one pawn, the other pawn moves forward, and again with the repetition of this process. Therefore, pretty easy. What happens if the king attacks the other pawn? The same. First, we need to draw or visualize the common box, and if the king cannot capture immediately the pawn, then the position is winning. We are going with the pawn that is more advanced from the other pawn, away farther from the king, and then we can see if the king cannot get into the square e6, it cannot catches the pawn. After the king gets closer, we have just reached the cutoff box, as we remember, and at this time the position is winning regardless who is on the move. If the king gets to the one pawn, the other pawn advances, and we are just repeating this process all over again. And what happens if the pawns are a little bit more separated, this time by 3 files? If the pawns are more separated, the most important is not the separation of the pawns, but rather if the pawns can create the square that touches the last rank, and the second condition, if king can capture the pawn immediately. If neither of the pawns can be captured immediately and the pawns are creating the square that touches the last rank, the position is winning. And now, as we can see, the pawn moves forward. If the king doesn't get into the square d5, it cannot catch the pawn that is running to the promotion. And now again, this time we have just reached immediately the cutoff square. And with cutoff square, as we already know, the position is winning regardless who is on the move. And then, if the king gets to one pawn, the other advance, and we have the same idea all over again. Of course, after this position f6, if the king gets from the d7 square, not going anywhere closer to any of the pawns, either of the pawns can move forward because we have reached the winning position due to the cutoff box. And of course, if the king gets the other pawn, let's say if the other pawn advances, maybe this way, we are just having the same type of idea, just mirrored one. And if the king is attacking the other pawn, again, quickly we can need to establish if we just reach the common box. If we did that and neither of the pawns can be immediately captured, the position is winning. We are just moving with the pawn that is farther away from the king, and thus repeat the process all over again until one of the pawns reaches the promotion. If the pawns are a little bit lower on the board, the less advanced ones, it is the same. The most important is to recognize if the pawns are on the same rank and if the pawns can reach the last rank with the square. If it is the common box, if neither of the pawns is captured, we are reaching the winning position. And now everything should be pretty clear. We are getting the pawn that is farther away from the king, and one of them reaches the promotion. And the last position, as we can see, the same type of position, but this time, as we can see, if the king wants to capture any of the pawns, the king needs to stay into the squares of the pawn. And if the king gets into the square right here, what happens? After, let's say, making with the move with the king, if the king gets there, we just reach the square that is the cutoff very quickly. After going here, the king cannot approach the pawn, the king cannot get below the line because the other pawn reaches the promotion quickly, and therefore if the king gets closer, at this moment we have already reached the cutoff square. And with cutoff square, regardless who is on the move, even if one of the pawn is captured, the other pawn advances, and therefore the winning position. And now we have the far to box position. What does it mean? It means that the square that is with the pawns doesn't touch the last rank. And now what happens at such situation? At such situation, some calculation and visualization is needed. And now what's going on at this position? First of all, we need to see that the king has the contact with one of the pawns. Therefore, one of the pawn is threatened to be captured. Therefore, we need to be aware of that. If the king captures this pawn on the c4 square, then the king is not getting outside the pawn box of the pawn f4. Therefore, if we do not move the pawn, this pawn is captured and the other would be caught very quickly. Therefore, we are moving forward with the pawn. And now what then? The king cannot capture the backward pawn because the more advanced pawn reaches the promotion. This is what we already know. But if the king gets closer to the pawn, the king is threatened to get to the pawn and capture this. If the black king can make two moves in a row, then it is again into the square of the promotion of the other pawn. Therefore, we cannot move the pawn forward, because if we just move the pawn forward, the king captures the pawn and is not leaving the promotion square of this pawn. Therefore, at this moment, we cannot move the pawn forward. After the pawn advances, if the king gets closer, now again, we are just into this square of the pawn on the left, and if the king captures it, it is not getting outside of this square. Therefore, if the pawn advances, we capture, and now as we can see, the king is getting into the square of the promotion by these two moves, either e7, either e6, and catching the pawn. Technically, even if the pawn is promoted, but the queen is not protected, therefore both pawns are lost. And take notice, we are only talking about the situation if the king doesn't support any of the pawns. And now another example. This time the king is not on the square c5, but the king is on the square f5. But the ideas are exactly the same. Now, as we can see, the square doesn't touch the last rank, therefore it's so-called far to box, and therefore if one pawn advances, the king gets closer. And again, if the pawn moves forward, the king captures the pawn and is not leaving the promotion square. And if another pawn moves forward, then the king captures this pawn and reaches the pawn box square of the pawn that is left on the board. Therefore, even if the pawn moves forward, the king capture is on the last rank. And of course, at this moment, as we can see, if the pawn just attacks the king, king can capture because it cannot leave the pawn box and reaches the pawn with the diagonal. And that's why at this moment, if it cannot transpose into the common box, then if one of the pawn is captured, it's immediate loss. And now one more type of explanation. As we can see, if the white pawn is getting forward right here, the king gets closer to this capture and get into the other pawn with the diagonal. Here is how it looks like. Now, the pawn is captured, the king didn't leave the pawn box and captures the other pawn as well. And now the same idea, but the pawn is on the right side that is being attacked, and if the pawn moves forward, the king attacks the pawn, and now, after the capture, as we remember, the king didn't leave the pawn box, and therefore it catches the pawn via the diagonal path. The conclusion. If we have the far to box, then we need to figure out if it is possible to get into the common box, and if the common box, neither of the pawns can be captured, the position is won. And let's have a look some of the interesting examples, how they can be played out. And now, as we just mentioned before, if the pawns are protecting each other, it's pretty simple. But sometimes it may be a little bit more difficult if there are so-called stalemate ideas. And most of the time, it's whenever the king can get into the corner, as at this example. Now let's check it out how it can be won. The king gets closer. Now, the king protects the pawn, therefore neither of the pawns can be captured. And if the king gets to the promoting line, into the corner, we cannot get any closer because it would result in a stalemate. If we get the other way, there is the only one legal move. And now, we sacrifice the pawn to have the king into the corner. After that, we get the opposition, forcing the king to leave the corner. And if the pawn gets to the next to the last rank, then without check, it is the winning position. After the king gets to h7, at this moment we have Stairway to Heaven, winning the game. And now the same position, but a little bit different plan. The same first moves, and now the king can get into these red squares. If the king gets to h6, of course, it's pretty easy because the pawn promotes. If the king gets to f8, the pawn promotes, therefore these moves we need to discard. After the king gets to the corner, we cannot get into the f6 square because it would result in a stalemate, but we can get the king into g5. After the only legal move, now we just sacrifice the pawn the same way as the previous example. After the king captures, we are winning both ways, either into the getting into f6 with the diagonal opposition, the way as we just saw in the previous example, or we can get into the other solution, we can get into the h6, again having the opposition, forcing the king to leave the corner, and the pawn gets to the 7th rank without check, and the position is won. Why? Because we are just creating Stairway to Heaven. And now what happens if we are just having this type of position? The previous position had just 2 pawns, at this moment we have the 3 pawns. Even though technically it's 3 pawns, but the double pawns are pretty much not that powerful. And therefore let's check it out how it can be won. The first moves are the similar as the previous position, with 2 pawns protecting each other. And now at this moment, the king cannot approach even closer onto the squares f7 or f6 because it would result in a stalemate. Therefore, after the king leaves the corner, now we are just making the sacrifice, promoting the pawn into the queen, forcing the king to capture. Again, white king cannot get any of these squares highlighted blue because it would result in a stalemate. Therefore, we are reaching the opposition, this time diagonal one. The king is forced to leave the corner. After that, we push the pawn onto the 7th rank without check. if the king leaves the promoting square, again, we need to be careful, because if we get with the king f7, then the king is unable to move anywhere because of the g5 pawn, therefore it would result in a stalemate. Therefore, at this moment, we are just making this move after king h7, making the sacrifice. After the king captures, we are just having the opposition. With the opposition, we are getting into the stairway to heaven a way easier. And now at this moment, the king must go on to h7, and now we are having stairway to heaven, winning the game. And now one more important moment. After the king gets to g7, we can win a little bit different way as well. Normal, we played king e6, but we can get into the promotion immediately. It is so-called alternate solution, a little bit faster way to win. After the king captures, again, we have the diagonal opposition, and the rest is the same as previously. And now stairway to heaven, and the pawn is promoted. And now what happens if we have the pawns that are separated by one file, and the opponent is having the pawn that is going into the promotion by itself? Let's check it out. Now, first move is to push the pawn forward, because if the king gets into the pawn trying to catch it, the king cannot capture the backward pawn, because more advanced pawn getting into the promotion and cannot be stopped. And then, if the pawn moving forward, we are getting into the direction of this pawn. And now, if the king tries to capture the pawn on the edge of the board, we are just getting closer and closer for the pawn. And the rule: whenever the king gets between the pawns on the empty file, between the pawns, we need to make the pawns on the same rank. And now, if the king approaches one of the pawn, the other pawn advance. And now we are just repeating the process over again. When one pawn is attacked, the other pawn advance. And now, the last part, if the king is getting in between the pawns, we need to make the pawns on the same rank. And now, after one pawn is attacked, the other pawn advance, and then this is the position that the king cannot make any moves to stop the pawn from promotion, therefore winning position. And now what happens if both sides have the pawns that are connected and one of the pawns protect the other? At this moment the position is drawn. If black to move, black is going to back and forth over these squares. They can get into this one as well, and with whites, white can get into this one back and forth. Neither of the sides can win, therefore if one of the sides try to capture the backward pawn, the other pawn advance, losing the game. And now what happens if white is on the move? It is the same. And now again, white would be going back and forth over these two squares. Black has a little bit more options. They can get into these three, and therefore the game ends in a draw. Neither of the sides can win. And now, what happens if we have the connected pawns versus the pawns that are separated by one file? Let's check it out. If white is to move, white approaches one of the pawns trying to capture, and now the same rule. If one of the pawns is attacked, the other pawn advance. Of course, the king cannot capture the backward pawn because the other pawn advance and getting into the promotion. Therefore, the king is getting to the other pawn, the more advanced ones from the other side. And now, black is going back and forth over these squares because they cannot capture the backward pawn because the other pawn advance. And after the king gets to f3, now black needs to repeat the moves. Why? Because if they didn't repeat the moves, if they start doing, let's say, different stuff, then it's going to be lost. For example, if black pawn gets into h2, then the king gets into g2, captures the pawn, and reaching the other pawn, pretty easily winning. And now, very important, if the king gets from the square f2 to f3, it's a draw. But if the king gets the other way, it's the loss. Why? Because at this moment, the king gets between the pawns, we are making the pawns on the same rank, and after that, if the king approach one of the pawn, the other pawn advance, and the king cannot longer stop the pawn from getting into the promotion. And now what happens if we have the position with two files that are separating the pawns? And now, first of all, we need to see if the square that the pawn creates are touching the last rank. If it touches, it's so-called common square. And now, after that, we need to immediately see if one of the pawns can be captured by the king. If it can't, the position is won by the opponent. And at this moment, white king cannot capture neither of the pawns, therefore at this moment black wins. After white starts attacking one pawn, the other moves forward. And now, at this moment, we have already reached the cut-off box. And at this moment, regardless who is on the move, even if one of the pawn is captured, the other pawn advances and promotes. Therefore, at this moment, the position is simply winning. Of course, if white moves any of the pawns, the king captures, and if the one pawn is captured, the other pawn can be stopped by the king as well. And now, what happens if it is black to move? The same position. At this moment, as we already established, the pawns are creating so-called common box, and neither of the pawns can be immediately captured. Very important. After the pawn moves forward, the king needs to get closer, trying to catch the pawn and capture it. And after that, we have already reached the cutoff box. And with the cutoff box, as I already mentioned, no matter who is on the move, no matter where are the kings, the position is won. And now, after the king captures one pawn, the other gets to the promotion. Of course, if the king gets the other way, into the f3 square, trying to capture the pawn on the e-file, the other pawn is simply getting to the promotion. And now, one of the exceptional position, because before we just saw the king was not that much advanced. At this moment, white king is pretty much advanced, and therefore the outcome is pretty much different. White to play and win. After the king gets to b6, take notice that the king is having the squares on the 7th rank, the pawns are trying to get forward, pretty much controlled, and now at this moment it's already winning. If black moves to their promotion, trying to as quickly as possible get the new queen, white is getting to the 7th rank with check. If the king gets into the c8 square, it's the promotion checkmate. If the king gets into the corner, of course, it is the pawn that is getting for the 7th rank. Take notice, it's not a stalemate because the pawns can move. And now, next move is a checkmate. Of course, if at this position, after the king b6, if the king gets to c8, it's winning as well. Because now, after the pawn moves forward, it's checkmate because the king cannot get to the 7th rank due to the pawn c6. And therefore, at this position, if the king can approach the pawn, or if the king can have stairway to heaven in one of the pawns, then the position is winning for the side who is making the queen first. And now one more position, pretty similar. At this moment, one of the pawns is protected. These are so-called connected pawns. And now, if black would be on the move, they would be playing back and forth, but way better would be just push one of the pawns into the promotion to make a new queen. But what happens if it is white to move? If it is white to move, white plays with the king, and now it is checkmate in one, regardless what black plays, which move they make with the pawn. And now checkmate, because the king cannot get into any of the squares. Therefore, remember, the exception if the pawns are very much advanced, and the king can get them into either the checkmate threat, either the stairway to heaven, it can be the position that is won for the side that is having more advanced pawns. And the last two cases. We were talking about the pawns that are separated by one file with so-called active defense. Let's check it out what happens if the defense is passive. The passive defense means that the king will for one of the pawns and from the other one from both of the sides, but rather trying to hold different way. Now, white to play. As we can see, these squares are covered by the pawns, therefore the king cannot capture the pawn because the other gets to the promotion, and now the king gets there. Now, after that, white moves closer with the king, and the king is going back and forth, up and down. And this is so-called passive defense. With passive defense, one must have the king closer in order to reach the stairway to heaven idea, and then one of the pawn gets into the promotion. And now, at this moment, pretty simple. And therefore, the passive defense would be to go with the king on the squares that is the same file as the pawn back and forth. If the king would be on the other one, it would be this one's back and forth. Now, if the king is making the active defense, as we just already seen in many of the examples, now the king will be trying to get into one of the pawns. Active defense makes the pawn moving forward without the support of the king. And now, at this moment, one of the pawn promotes. And therefore, depending what are the requirements of the position, we can either make the passive defense, getting back and forth with the king, or active defense, getting from the other pawn. With the active defense, if the king is trying to reach one of the pawns can get into the promotion without the support of the king. With the passive defense, the pawns cannot move forward, the king must support either of these pawns. And the time for the summary. The strongest formation is when the pawns are standing next to each other on adjacent files on the same rank. These pawns are so strong because they create a barrier on the same rank and cannot be attacked from the front. At the same time, when the pawns are attacked from the side, either of them can advance and protect the other. When we have a duo of protected pawns, the backward pawn cannot be captured as the other pawn will reach promotion. At the same time, the frontal attack is not possible as the backward pawn protects its more advanced colleague. When we have two pawns standing on the same rank separated by one empty file, the pawns are safe. The defending side cannot capture both pawns because when one pawn is attacked, the other advances and then the backward one cannot be captured. The defending side must hold both pawns on the same rank by keeping the king on the empty file between the pawns. This makes the pawns safe. Two pawns standing on the same rank with any number of empty files between them is safe as long as the opponent's king gets out of the pawn box, so-called pawn square, after one of the pawns is captured. It is simple to visualize this by drawing the pawn box of the distance pawn towards the king. The moment the king captures one pawn, it leaves the other pawn's box. This situation always applies when the moving square goes beyond the last rank, no matter the pawn's position. Therefore, way to get a winning position is to create a moving square that goes beyond the last rank, so-called cutoff box. If the pawns have a common pawn box that touches the last rank, then if one pawn gets captured, the other one will be captured too, as the king stays inside the pawn box after the capture and catches the other pawn via a diagonal chase. If neither of the pawns get captured, then the more distant pawn moves first, attracting the king. Then the other pawn moves, creating a new moving square, pushing it forward beyond the last rank and reaching a winning position, cut-off box. If the moving square doesn't touch the last rank, the pawns are in danger. If they cannot safely create a moving square that goes beyond the last rank, they need the king's support. Otherwise, they will be captured. However, before that, we need to figure out if reaching a common pawn box is possible. If neither pawn is captured in the process, the position is winning as the pawns can quickly create a winning moving square, cut-off box. If the opponent's king stands between the separated pawns on the starting position, on the same rank, then the position is winning regardless of who is to move and whenever the king captures a pawn. This is because either of the pawns can move two squares and the king cannot catch it. The further the moving square is from the last rank, the more we need to calculate. When it goes beyond the last rank, cut-off box, no calculation is needed. When we reach a common box, one that touches the last rank, we only need to check out if one of the pawns can be immediately captured, then we lose both pawns. Otherwise, we reach a winning position, and again, no calculation is needed, just a recognition. The only situation that requires normal calculation and a bit of visualization is when the moving square does not touch the last rank, far-to-box type. And to be clear, we only consider or analyze all of these positions when the king cannot support the pawns. And now I hope after this review of the situations related to the moving square, I guess you'll understand why it is that much important to know it, because sometimes even though you have a pretty big advantage, it may not be that easy to convert it into the win. But I believe that if you understand and just make some kind of practice about this type of positions related to the moving square, you will be understanding this way better, and at the same time your scores with the practical play will get better as well. Therefore, thank you very much for watching and see you next time. Take care.